Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is a Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
It's another episode of A Nation of Taxpayers, the podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance, a welcome relief from the centrist dad-style podcasts that litter the audio landscape. My name's Duncan Barkes. I'm your host on this week's podcast. We're joined by Elliot Keck from the TPA. Hello, Elliot.
Good afternoon, Duncan.
And also our special guest is Ted Bromund, former Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome.
Good to be with you, Duncan.
And I've got to say thank you, because we might as well reveal to our listeners, because we have this kind of relationship with our listeners to this podcast, Ted, that you're fresh off the plane.
Correct. Landed 6 hours ago.
Listen, there's so many things to talk about. And one of the major things that's doing the rounds actually this week is the relationship going forward that the UK could have or should have with the US. Obviously, we have President-elect Trump. We've got some news stories circulating with Prime Minister Starmer saying he wants even closer ties with the US. We also have a narrative that I think's been developing. And let me know what you think about this, Elliot. This idea that Starmer might have to choose between the US or the EU.
Yeah, I think it's easy to frame these things in binary terms. It's not all or nothing.
Yeah.
The question is whether or not Starmer could establish closer ties with both. It's not like, moving closer to the United States is going to mean that Brussels are going to cease contact. But listen, the instinct from Brussels is always to regulate and regulate and regulate, whereas the instinct under certainly the incoming Trump administration does seem like it's going to be completely the opposite. And so, I think this dream that he can establish closer relationships with both parts of the world and with both, potential blocs, I'm not convinced he's going to be successful in that.
Ted, what should it look like, the future relationship with the UK and the US?
So when I think about the US-UK relationship, I think about an iceberg. That the political stuff is the stuff on the top of the water. That's presidents and prime ministers, and that's really important. But 90% of the relationship between Britain and the US is under the water. It's the part you don't see. It's the relationship between the city and Wall Street. It's the relationship between our educational institutions, between our militaries, between our intelligence institutions. The fact that millions of Americans come to London and outside of London every year. The fact that millions of Brits come to the US. Many of them even decide to live there. All of that stuff is at least as important long-term as the political stuff. More important, I think. So when I think about good US-UK relations, I want to build the bottom of the iceberg. I want to come up with things that make it easier, as Churchill once put it, for our two nations to be mixed up together. Not in a way that derogates either of our sovereignty, but in a way that lets free people choose freely what they want to do, and that makes it easier for us to get along with each other.
Do you think Starmer's got the political nous to actually make it work with Donald Trump?
I hope he does. I'm not a fan of Prime Minister Starmer, but I hope for both of our countries' sakes that he can. I think it would be very churlish to wish ill will to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, whoever it might be, because the UK needs the US and the US needs the UK, and we can't get along if that relationship is a bad one. I think it's going to be very difficult, however. Labour Party polling here is not looking particularly good. President Trump is going to be well aware of that fact. He's going to want to do things and is going to ask things of the UK that Labour is going to find very difficult to do. One of them is certainly going to be increasing defense spending. Not a lot of appetite for that under Labour, although to be fair, not much appetite for it under the Tories either. That's going to be a big ask. Defense spending has just brought down the German government. How popular will it be here?
What do you think, Elliot? Do you think Starmer's got what it takes to make this relationship work going forward with President-elect Trump?
I think the problem with Starmer is that he seemingly has this massive desire to be prominent on the world stage. He loves going into all these global conferences and meetups. He loves seemingly engaging with foreign diplomats and foreign leaders. Just today, for example, he's meeting the Greek Prime Minister, he's meeting the Emir of Qatar. So it's something that he seems to be very passionate about, but he seems to view his role as being one of many global leaders working together on various issues and not representing the national interest of the United Kingdom. And the best example of that is on, the Chagos Islands, which they're now trying to rush through the sale of before the Trump administration comes to office, because there's concerns, I think very clear concerns, that the Trump administration will be incredibly opposed to giving up British sovereignty on an island that has such an important US military base. And I don't think this is just with Trump. I think this is all American presidents. American presidents have a really strong idea in general what their national interest is. There's a reason why America is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, for example. And I think that if Starmer wants to engage productively with Trump, I take what Ted said about the iceberg, but if Trump and Starmer don't get along, then that's not going to be the death knell for the US-UK relationship. Far from it. It's too durable to be damaged in just a few years, or at least critically damaged. But if Starmer really wants to engage with Trump, I think the Trump administration and Trump would respect a prime minister that is engaging with the administration based on a very profound belief in furthering the UK national interest, rather than a belief in fostering vague and nebulous ideas like global cooperation or sort of global amity, I suppose.
And we know that Trump likes this country, and in any other world, I'd be sitting here thinking, the most obvious thing to do is you organise a state visit, and he comes over and you get out the best cutlery and the glasses of Buckingham Palace, you roll out to royals, we have a massive procession, it's all lovely, etc. But it's still fresh in my memory what happened last time we had a state visit, particularly in London. And I was embarrassed. That we had Donald Trump in this country, President of the United States of America, and we have Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, who has gone on the record to say he doesn't like Trump, but he's used some quite harsh words in the past. And he sanctioned the massive protest. And we had the embarrassment of this kind of like this blimp balloon in Parliament Square of a baby Trump, I think in a nappy.
Yeah.
And it's just like, in what world do you think is that acceptable? And my fear would be, if you organised another state visit to kind of like grease the wheels, which is what I would be doing, because to me it's obvious and we should be doing it, we would have those embarrassing scenes again.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's quite likely that you would. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to have cooled President-elect Trump's enthusiasm for the UK, so perhaps no real damage has been done there. Look, the real nub of this is going to be that President-elect Trump has said that he wants to impose tariffs on U.S. imports. There have also been sort of sounds coming out of the incoming administration already that they want a U.S.-UK trade deal. And that's where the rubber hits the road on the relationship between the UK, the EU, and the US. Because I basically agree with Elliot that the UK cannot fundamentally choose between Europe and the United States. Both are very important. But you can choose between whether you want an economy structured by EU rulemaking or an economy that is free to do trade deals around the world, including with the United States. Now, you know what you get with the EU. You get preferential access. You already have free trade, but you get even more preferential access to EU markets. You also get much lower growth overall as EU regulatory power creeps in. That's a place where you can't choose, or you can't just have both. You got to have one or the other. And I think it's going to be really tough for a Labour government to say, yeah, we want to have closer relations with the EU, but we'd also really like to have that U.S. trade deal. But, that's going to be really tough.
It's going to be a choice then, isn't it?
It really does have to be.
It has to be a choice, which puts Starmer in a really difficult position.
Yeah, and one thing that I think does make me slightly more optimistic than maybe I should be about the prospects of the US-UK trade deal is that, this government needs something to point at when it comes to economic growth. It needs something because it's just hiked national insurance by 1.2 percentage points on employers. It's halved the point at which you start paying national insurance. There's a whole range of other, really growth-focused taxes that they've gone after. Capital gains tax is another one. There needs to be something. There needs to be a shiny bauble, to use a Christmas analogy, I suppose, given the time of year, that they can point at and say, listen, I know things are tough now, but, we've just signed a trade deal with one of the most powerful, dynamic economies in the world. And, that would, and in fairness, that'd be a really difficult one for the Conservatives to go back on. A Conservative opposition, if Labour Party agreed a trade deal with the United States. I don't see how a Conservative opposition, particularly one led by Kenny Badenoch, who was the International Trade Secretary, I don't see how they could do anything other than welcome it with fully open arms. And it would be a pretty big political and economic win for the Labour government. So it would be interesting to see how that develops.
Ted, your thoughts whilst we remain chewing this over. Do you think the Reform Party leader, Nigel Farage, who some believe is probably Trump's biggest ally in this country, given their relationship, does he have a part to play in keeping the relationship warm and building it?
I hope he does, but in British political terms, the central point of the Reform Party has been to take votes away from the Conservatives and give them vastly fewer MPs than they would otherwise have. Now, many people would say that the Tories deserved every little bit of that, and they needed the right good kicking, and Nigel Farage and others administered it. It's one thing to say that, and another thing to say that a relatively small, in fact, an almost vanishingly small party in Parliament, which frankly I have trouble viewing even as a real party. I've watched UKIP for many years. These have always been movements. They've not really been proper parties. Inherent in being a party is that the party leader can get the boot if things are going badly. Is Nigel Farage going to get the boot from Reform? There is no Reform without Nigel Farage. So, I'm skeptical of the parliamentary value of these kind of institutions. They're much better in terms of mobilizing public opinion, but are they going to mobilize public opinion in a way that a Labour government is going to find comfortable, or even a hypothetical future Conservative government is going to be able to deal with? Difficult.
It's really interesting to get your take on reform and where it may or may not be heading. And I'll ask you a similar question about the Conservative Party before we wrap up this podcast, because it'd be fascinating to get your view on where they're currently at and where they may be going. Let's just stay with Trump for a second, and let's just extend it to Elon Musk. Now, we know that Elon Musk had a massive part to play in Trump's electoral victory. What's your take on Elon Musk?
Well, I'm not actually sure that he did have that massive a part to play in Trump's victory. The saying over here is that governments lose elections, oppositions don't win them. No one liked Kamala Harris before she all of a sudden got the nomination. And then as soon as she did, she was immediately invested with all sorts of qualities that no one 6 hours before that point had ever thought that she possessed. So, that automatically put her in a really deep hole. But, can Musk or Elon Musk's money play a significant role here? I'm skeptical. UK has really tight campaign finance laws. I mean, when I ran a campaign in York Central in 2017, the spending limit was like £10,500. It's very difficult to see how you can do, how could you spend Elon Musk kind of money here within the law?
There are two things here, though. I mean, first off, so I want to be clear that I've understood you correctly. So in terms of Trump's victory, are you saying that Elon Musk didn't have a massive part to play in it?
I think he had some part to play. What Musk has done is that he's made a brand of conservatism, or at least libertarianism, cool. I mean, this is a guy who builds enormous space rockets and catches them with chopsticks.
A few hundred staff, right?
With a few hundred staff, who's done something that NASA couldn't do in 50 years with, thousands of times as much money, who digs tunnels faster and better than anyone has dug them before. And, regardless of what you think about him as an individual or anything else, all that stuff is pretty cool. And so it's lent a kind of a coolness factor to free enterprise, to smaller government, to a kind of libertarian conservatism that the U.S. hasn't had for quite a while, and I don't think the U.K. has had for quite a while either. And that's really helpful. It establishes kind of the Overton window, as folks like to say, of things that are discussable or popular or potentially popular or even cool. Did lots of people vote for Trump because of Musk? I think the inflation rate and the immigration rate were a lot more salient than Elon Musk.
And part two of that answer is related also to the answer you gave previously. This idea, and we read some stories about this inside the last few days. Elon Musk might give a load of money to the Reform Party in the UK as a bit of a battering to Starmer for the reasons you've outlined. You don't think that would make much of a difference?
I really struggle to see. I mean, I'm always really wary of comparisons between the U.S. and the U.K. They're very different countries with very different systems. And $100 million is a lot of money. But, having seen the way the Conservative Party works, and I'm using air quotes when I say works there, you need better data. You need a better on-the-ground machine. You need to rebuild, you had a reform equivalent of the Young Conservatives, which have basically disappeared. All that sort of infrastructure building stuff. That's not, money's really helpful, but it's also a question of party willingness to actually invest in it. And the Conservatives have not been willing to invest in that kind of stuff for a long time. Is a more movement kind of party like Reform going to have the patience to dig in for 5 or 10 years and do boring things like, develop positions on the rates and, I really have trouble seeing that.
It's interesting your use of the word their movement, because when I was on social media just earlier before we started this recording of the podcast, Nigel Farage was getting very excited about the fact that he's now got 1 million followers on TikTok. That almost strengthens your movement argument. Does that necessarily translate into real world support for young men across the country or a younger generation? It doesn't, does it?
Not necessarily. And it's not just where the Reform Party is currently. I think this goes back as far as UKIP. That, they've done well in some European elections. They got a lot of second places at this last election, largely from disaffected Conservative voters. But a UK political party needs a full apparatus, and it needs positions on virtually everything under the sun, even the 95% of issues that are really boring. And UKIP was never able and never interested in doing that kind of stuff. And I don't see Reform as being particularly able or interested in doing that kind of stuff. And until you are, you're not a party in the UK sense, you're a movement.
Elliot, 2 questions to you related to what Ted's been talking about. First off, Elon Musk, his role with Donald Trump in terms of winning the election, did he have a role to play? And secondly, we'll pick up on the reform point that Ted made as well. So let's kick off with Musk. Did he have a part to play, or was he just the right person in the right place at the right time and an example of the kind of ideology, philosophy that Donald Trump supports?
Listen, I'm not going to challenge Ted's expertise on this, but if there was one thing, observing from afar that I noticed was that, the second Kamala Harris came in, there was this very brief moment where the Kamala campaign looked slightly fresher than the Donald Trump campaign. Donald Trump has been around for a long time. He's quite old. The second that Joe Biden's gone, that weakness that Trump has, which is his age, suddenly comes to the front. And of course, that weakness didn't exist before. What Elon did, though, I think, is that it changed the formula quite significantly on that one. Suddenly, actually, it was the Trump campaign that seemed the energetic, the slightly more youthful, the more dynamic, and that's because of who Elon Musk is as a personality. And it's really stark now looking at the upcoming Department of Government Efficiency or DOGE that Elon Musk is going to be running. And we'll see how long does that actually last. We'll see how long before Elon Musk ruffles so many feathers that they deem him not worth it. But it's really stark comparing him leading the Department of Government Efficiency and the person that we have here running the Office for Value for Money, or the independent chair of the Office for Value for Money, whose CV includes HS2, leading on the delivery of the UK Olympics, which I think was twice over budget, playing a leading role in the Houses of Parliament restoration, which I don't think even has any kind of budget or any kind of time frame. I think they're talking about decades and tens of billions of pounds. And I think that is such a stark comparison. And, whatever you want to say about Elon Musk, he's a truly dynamic character, genuine visionary. And I think it's a bit depressing looking at who the current UK equivalent is.
So we need a bit of Muskism over here in terms of slashing bureaucracy, regulation and spending.
Yeah, and listen, you know, it's something that I think Ted might have thoughts on, but talking about cutting government spending is easier than actually identifying what you're going to cut. And often when you talk about cutting government spending, you're talking about trimming things around the edges, and actually the big meaty things right in the middle, in particular things like pensions and the NHS, get left out of the equation. And there is a lot of stuff you can do around the margins, and government can be made a lot more efficient and a lot more productive without going after the big ticket items. But ultimately, in the long term, if you really want to change the picture of government spending, you do need to look at the big ticket items.
I just want to get your thoughts as well about the word movement regarding Reform UK. Now, you and I on this podcast have talked about reform in the past.
Yeah.
About how it's almost like Parliament suffocates reform a little bit because they've got 5 MPs. They can't get any positions on any of the select committees, etc., because they're deemed too small. Is there some work still to be done or to be started regarding changing the perception that Ted outlined, which is reform still seen as a movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think reform have a couple of things in their favour, which is they will have multiple electoral cycles at which they have good chance to help deliver and continue the momentum that they've gained, in particular the Senate elections next year. So we've just seen Andrew R.T. Davies has stepped down as leader of the Welsh Party. His strategy has been very explicitly lead the Welsh Conservatives from a very right-wing perspective to try and hoover up as many reform votes as possible. Now that he's gone, will the Welsh Conservatives move to the centre and that help reform? I think you also do have, and I definitely take Ted's point. They don't have a policy platform on everything. They don't have a position on everything. They don't have a position on how do you reform bin collections for local councils, for example. But you are already seeing a couple of their MPs take on a lot of focus and a couple of pet projects. You particularly look at Rupert Lowe and the way that he's going after the Home Office over their refusal to publish statistics on crime committed by immigrants and asylum seekers. And I think there is a sign that the new MPs do get it, do recognise that they could, easily become lost in the often quite suffocating nature of Parliament. And I think there is a sign that they do get it, and that they're recognising that there are certain campaigns, certain areas of work that they can actually make a difference. They can cause a lot of noise on.
Rupert Lowe is doing some tremendous work at the moment, actually, because he's using the system to his advantage as opposed to just saying, well, this is wrong. He's playing the game, and we're starting to see some really interesting, I think we will start to see some more interesting results coming out. Ted, I said earlier we talk about the Conservative Party. We have a new leader in the form of Kemi Badenoch. What's your take on where the Conservatives are at, and where should they be heading in terms of potential future electoral success?
Well, I'll take the liberty of repeating some things I said at Conservative Party conference and a couple of fringe events a few months ago. Look around Europe. Look at all of the traditional European center-right parties. Most of them have been utterly destroyed. Where are the Gaullists in France? They're completely gone. Where are the traditional Christian Democrats in Italy? They're utterly gone. Spanish conservatives, gone. Portuguese conservatives, gone. CDU in Germany is probably going to win the next election, but that says more about the weakness of the FPD than it does about the strength of the CDU. The party that's on the rise there is AFD, Alternative for Deutschland. And I give them 1 or 2 more electoral cycles before they clean the CDU's clock and drive them out of business. The lesson is that all of the center-right parties in Europe have been destroyed from the right, not from the center. Now, I know the UK is different. It's got a different political culture. It's got a different history. I know all of that. But it's not that different. If the Conservatives don't adopt a policy of no enemies on the right, they're going to be destroyed from the right, just like all the other mainstream center-right parties in Europe have been. And, I don't think reform is necessarily going to take over, but reform has demonstrated that it can take enough votes from the Conservative Party to prevent them from ever being a government. And some way or another, the Conservatives have got to get those votes back. One of the leadership contenders at the last Tory leadership contest kept on saying, we need to get the Lib Dem votes back. Now, that is absolutely crazy. The Conservatives do not have a future unless they get their right wing back.
I don't think they fully grasp that yet, because I keep hearing shadow ministers on the radio talking about a vote for reform is just a vote for Labour. And, it's almost like they're not taking it seriously. It's like we've got this two-party system and you need to vote for us or vote for Labour. Those are the only options. And I don't think they're really acknowledging the threat the reform is on the right.
Yeah, I think I've never been afraid for the future of the Conservative Party before. I was in the UK in 1997 after Tony Blair won his enormous victory. And I wasn't afraid for the future of the Conservative Party then. They had not done brilliantly under John Major. They probably deserved to lose. And Blair, in some ways misleadingly, was a very compelling candidate at the time. For the first time in my life now, I am actually afraid for the future of the Conservative Party. Not because Labour is so great, Labour is dreadful, but if reform continues to take 30-40% of that core conservative vote, the Conservatives are trapped somewhere in the range of below 150 MPs. Math has never been my strong point, but I don't think that gets you near a majority.
I think you're right. Listen, a final story that's been circulating this week that I'd be grateful for both your views on. It's one of my favourites, really. It's this idea that we have a number of new Labour MPs in Parliament since July, a number of whom are quite young, certainly compared to me. They call them Gen Z MPs. So Gen Z, if you're not clear, and you're listening to this podcast, are people born between 1995 and 2012. And apparently a number of new Labour Gen Z MPs are calling for a 3-day week in Parliament. You go from 4 days to 3. So at the moment you do Monday to Thursday in the Palace of Westminster. Friday is a constituency day. They want to do less time in Parliament. They also want a looser dress code as well and not feel that they have to wear a tie. So really, concerned about the issues that really matter to most British people. Ted, your thoughts on this?
I think this is a brilliant idea, except it does not go far enough. I would support a 0-day policy for all Labour MPs, and for that matter, for a fair number of Conservative MPs too. Look, the less they're in Westminster, the less damage they can do. They're not going to hold the government to account, so they might as well just go home.
Yeah. And they can stop interfering in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that. The less time they spend in Westminster, the less time they have to pass things like the Football Governance Bill, right? Or the many other countless pieces of legislation that are just going to make life more difficult for businesses, more difficult for taxpayers. So I am sympathetic to that. I think actually, in reality, you look at the parliamentary timetable, it's already a 3-day week. I mean, in reality, the House doesn't start sitting until 2:30 on a Monday. It doesn't start sitting until 11:30 on a Tuesday. I think it only sits for around 150 days per year. There's quite significant recesses. So, if MPs were going to spend their time in Parliament looking at how to lift the burdens on businesses and taxpayers, then I'd like them to be working, 5 or 6 day weeks. But if they're going to be spending their days working out how to make life a little bit more miserable for everyone, then maybe a 0-day per week policy would actually be a better one.
Gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure on this episode. Ted Bromund, former Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. A pleasure to meet you, and thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Duncan.
Stepping off the plane straight into our podcast studio, and Elliot Keck from the TPA. Always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you. If you're a regular listener to this podcast, first of all, thank you. Secondly, you can help us. And if you're a new listener, you can help us as well. So a couple of things. If you'd like to get in contact, we have an email address. It is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com, podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. Any people you'd like to hear guested on this podcast, do let us know any thoughts or feedback. That is the email address to use. And the other thing you can do, well, actually 2 other things. First off, you can follow and subscribe. So you can find us on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Spotify. We're now on YouTube as well. Follow and subscribe because that helps us tremendously. Also, you can leave a decent review. There's an emphasis on the word decent there. A good review regarding this podcast, because all of that, the follow, the subscribe, leaving a decent review helps with the algorithms, and it means more people get to hear about this podcast, A Nation of Taxpayers, from the Taxpayers Alliance. Thank you for listening.